Hi everyone, today we're going to discuss variables in Python. So in my previous video, the variables that I discussed were how variables work in most other programming languages. In Python, variables work a little differently. So the first thing we need to understand this is that Python is an object-oriented language. Now to actually understand what an object-oriented language is a huge task, and we'll have to learn a lot of other things for this first. But for now, it's okay for you to just know that all data in Python is in the form of something known as objects. So data data isn't just stored as some value in Python. It's stored in the form of an object that has that value inside it. Okay. Now, variables in Python are just names that are given to these objects that hold data. These objects also reside in some place in memory, but it's better if we think about variables in Python just in terms of these objects. Okay, so variables are just names given to objects. Another way to think about this is that variables are things that point to objects in Python. Okay, so an example here would be that this variable x is pointing to this object that of John. Okay, this variable y is pointing to the object of the integer 16, right? So that's how variables work in Python. Now let's see how exactly this is different from how variables work in most other programming languages. The first thing is that Python doesn't require you to give explicit data types to your variables. So if you're writing code in Java or C++, whenever you're using a variable, it has to have an explicit data type, right? It has to be int x or char y or something like that. But in Python, it's okay for you to just write x. The second difference is about declaring a variable. In Python, declaration of a variable happens just when you initialize the variable, right? In Java or C++, these two are separate steps. You could write them in one statement even in Java and C++, but fundamentally these would still be two different steps. But in Python, this is one indivisible step. When you write x is equal to 32, that is when declaration of x and initialization of x both happen together. Okay, so what happens when you actually write x is equal to 32? What happens is that the compiler makes a new object that has the data integer 32 in it. Okay, and then x starts pointing to this new object. That's how variables are declared and initialized in Python. Now, what happens if I say that x is equal to 32 and y is equal to 32? What happens if two variables have the same data in Python? Okay, what will happen is that when I write y is equal to 32 now, the compiler already knows that it had made an object that has the data 32 in it, right? So it won't make an other object that has the data 32 and then make y point to that. It will just find the original object that had the data 32 in it, and y will also point to that same object. This is very different from how variables having same data works in Java or C++. In Java or C++, the code might be something like this: int x is equal to 32 and int y is equal to 32. What will happen during the execution of this code is that the compiler will declare the variable x, so it will allot a memory location for and call it x, and the value 32 will be put into this memory location. Now when you write int y is equal to 32, it will declare a separate, completely different memory location and call it y and put the same value 32 in it, right? So clearly this works differently in C++ and in Python. Another difference is how modifying values of variables works. So in Python, let's say the original value of x was 32. Now if I write this statement x is equal to 16, what's going to happen is x is just going to stop pointing to this object that has the value 32 in it, and x is going to start pointing to this new object which has the value 16 in it. Okay, this has an this method of modifying the values of variables that is used in Python has a really interesting consequence. The consequence is that now if I write something like x is equal to John, this doesn't give an error in Python. Even though the previous value of x was an integer, this doesn't give an error in Python. Okay, so the data types of variables can switch, and the reason for this is really simple, right? What's going to happen when I write x is equal to John is that the compiler is just going to make a new object that resides in a new place in memory, and that object will have the data John in it, right? Now x will just stop pointing to 16 and start pointing to John, right? So x doesn't have to have some inherent data type associated with it, and that's why it just takes the data type of whichever object it's pointing to, right? And this pointing keeps changing. Okay, in Java or C++, however, when I declare x as an integer, that means I'm saying that this memory location that is called x always has to store integer values, right? That can't change. That memory location should always have integer values only. But here we make a separate memory location and we make a separate object and we write John in that object, and now x has stopped being the name of that previous memory location and started being the name of this new memory location. This is why it's okay and it works that x doesn't have a data type associated with it. So that's all about Python and variables in Python. If you have any doubts, please feel free to leave them in the comments, and thank you.